Martin said, the book is about evangelical Christian responses to Islam. I've tried to take as wide a view as I can around the world. It's kind of like woefully inadequate. So I'm sure that there are going to be other things that I've missed as well, but I'm very happy to hear questions or suggestions at the end that might point me in the right direction. But what I want to do for the next few minutes is to think about whether 2001 was a turning point in evangelical responses. That obviously dates back to 9/11. Need just to think very briefly about what I'm even talking about when I'm talking about evangelicals, and you might already be thinking that you're not quite sure that that's a valid term to use nowadays. But I want to think a little bit about the different ways that evangelicals are responding, or at least how that's been described by observers. But then the main thing that I want to do is to look at some of the research that's been done in the last 20 years into those responses. And so we're going to see a series of textual studies that have been done, and then also some empirical fieldwork based studies. And I just want to point out some work that's been done in Africa as well. And then we'll end up with thinking about where some of the gaps are and what could usefully be research going into the future. So at the end of the 20th century, you don't really find any books or articles particularly talking about evangelical responses. It normally comes much more under the title of Protestant missionary writing about Islam or something of that nature. And some of you will know Kate Zuberi's book, Christians and Muslims Face to Face, and that's exactly what she refers to, Protestant missionary responses. And yet, as soon as we go through 9/11, then there's a veritable, what Thomas Kidd calls a flood of Christian publishing. A lot of it, of course, quite negative, looking at the violence that's occurred and why it's occurring. And so for my book, I've identified over 300 volumes that have been written since 2001, written by evangelicals, and another 20 edited volumes. So there's been a lot that's been printed, and a great range of titles, right from very literally, Islam is of the devil, was a title, through to much more Irenic things, kissing cousins even. So we'll see all of those types of responses as we go through that are emerging from some of the studies that have been done. Whenever I start to talk about evangelicals today, there's always somebody in the room who says, "Oh, really? Is that even a valid term? What do you mean by evangelical?" Or even more common, "I hope you're not referring to me." A lot of people have a bit of an allergic reaction to being labelled evangelical just because of some of the polarised responses that there have been since 9/11. One of the older and very popular definitions of evangelical came from David Bebbington, and he saw 4 elements of what he would use to define as evangelical. He said that evangelicals believe in conversion. In other words, you have to voluntarily join. You can't be born into the movement. You take some step to become part of that movement, what Weber would call the community of the born again. And then with that, he saw a degree of activism, you might call it evangelism, says it in the title, evangelical, wanting to pass that faith on to others. And then 2 other defining characteristics, an emphasis on the Bible and the importance of the Bible, which he called biblicism, and then an emphasis on the cross of Christ, which he called crucicentrism. And he said that these 4 things, which became called a quadrilateral, were what defines an evangelical. Others have played around with that. David Bebbington's pupil, Timothy Larson, agreed with some of it, but said, well, hold on, then couldn't Francis of Assisi be an evangelical? So he had some other things. He says, well, it's to do with the Holy Spirit, but then particularly it's to do with being Protestant and he made some sort of link to the 18th century revivalist movements of Whitefield and Wesley. David Bebbington's response was that he was quite happy for Francis of Assisi to be an evangelical. But it does seem that there's definitely a trans-denominational element to evangelicalism. That goes right across different Protestant denominations. So you might find people in established sacramental churches that would espouse or use the term evangelical. So it could be Anglican, Lutheran, and so on. And also those amongst the nonconformist or reformed churches, could be Baptist, could be Pentecostal, a multitude of other Protestant denominations might also call themselves evangelical. And you might well actually find that an evangelical Methodist considers that they have more in common with an evangelical Baptist than they do with another Methodist who is maybe more liberal. And so that it's a theme that, or a trend that cuts across denominations in somewhat of the same way as the charismatic movement also cuts across denominations. And many charismatics would also identify themselves as evangelical as well. But then the question comes, well, what about a bit further outside of the Protestant movement? I mentioned Francis of Assisi, and there would be many, particularly on the more Irenic, more progressive end of the evangelical spectrum, that would very happily engage with Catholics, particularly thinking of Christian-Muslim relations. There would be those who would relate to people like Dan Madigan and Gavin da Costa and so on, and really not see any particular boundary there. And so they would relate very happily, whereas people at the other end of the evangelical spectrum may very well feel that Catholics are just as far beyond the pale as the Muslims are. And that's such is the nature of evangelicalism. The same might go for orthodoxy as well. There would be some who would be very happy to engage with the Orthodox who are engaged in Christian-Muslim relations. Interestingly, at the other end, the more reactionary, conservative, combative end of evangelicalism, some of them are also happy to engage with Catholics and particularly Orthodox if they actually share an anti-Muslim agenda. And so you might think of somebody like Father Zachariah Boutros, who's an Egyptian Copt, who appears on satellite TV and is extremely polemic. He's always asking questions of Islam, and in actual fact, Muslim leaders accuse him of converting thousands of Muslims because of the questions he's raising. And so there are some, even conservative evangelicals, that would almost claim Boutros as their own just because of this shared stance that they both take on Islam and Muslims, which is quite interesting. There are all sorts of ways of labeling evangelicals or thinking of them on a spectrum. And so certainly at one end, we might talk about conservative evangelicals. And these are the evangelicals who are normally very happy to be called evangelicals. They would see that as a badge of honor. At the other end, more progressive, we sometimes say open evangelical, or even the term liberal evangelical. These are the people who sometimes feel like they don't necessarily want to be associated as evangelicals. I was talking to one very prominent evangelical a few days ago, whose books appear in my book. I regularly cite him, and he was saying sometimes, he said, I just feel embarrassed to call myself an evangelical when I look at how other evangelicals are responding. And so some have come up with new names or different labels. Think of Tony Campolo, who is a progressive evangelical in the States, very well known. And he and some others have come up with the label red letter Christian. And by this, they're referring to versions or publications of the Bible that print the words of Jesus in red letters in the gospel. And so what Campolo is saying here is my guide is not necessarily biblicist. It's not all of this. I particularly want to follow Jesus. I'm particularly focusing on the words of Jesus in the Gospels, those that are in red letters in my print version of the Gospel. Others are part of something that has become called the emergent church. These are Christians who are looking to see church emerge in different ways in a new cultural context. And they often would point to conservative evangelicals and say the cultural form of church that they have is no longer fit for purpose today. We need to see, and in another context we might call it contextualization, but we need to see a church that is more fit for the context today. Brian McLaren might be a name particularly associated with the emergent church movement. And of course, in both of these cases, people on opposite ends of the evangelical spectrum tend to feel like the people on the other end have actually dropped off the end and are maybe even no longer evangelicals. In which case they sometimes get labeled post-evangelical. This is a term that some people actually use of themselves. They might actually say, I am post-evangelical. I've moved on from conservative evangelicalism in some ways. Sometimes it's an accusation made by those who are still evangelical. So just to sum up, in my writing, I don't actually try and have a very tight definition of evangelical. I kind of like what Os Guinness said when he said evangelicals are just people of the gospel. Of course, that's very, very fluffy. It depends what you think the gospel is. And so the people that feature in my book are probably Protestant. They do take the Bible seriously, but that doesn't mean to say that they all take it in the same way. There are different ways of interpreting things. They all agree that Jesus was in some way unique. And again, though, there might be some disagreement about what that uniqueness consists in. But they all do have some sort of sense of mission, a sense of call, a sense to engage with Muslims. And that's something that means that, in actual fact, these people recognize one another. There's some sense where these people feel they should be in the same family, which means that if somebody within this tradition says something that they disagree with, they feel more aggrieved than, for instance, if a Catholic said it. Because in actual fact, they expect to disagree with Catholics. They might not even think that Catholics are in the same family. But when this person has said it, that hurts, that isn't right. And that's because there's a sense of recognition that this person either used to be or should be part of maybe a clan. So just before we go on and see some of the other research, I just want to have a very quick think about what Muslims think about all of this. It's great that we got some Muslims with us today, and maybe you're there thinking, well, I'm not really interested, or I don't know what an evangelical is, or maybe you actually have a very strong idea of what an evangelical is. And when I was doing my PhD research years ago, I did ask some Muslims as I was going around, just what do you think an evangelical is? Who are they? And I particularly remember one Muslim community leader in Bristol called Farouk, who immediately came back with a very clear answer. And this was actually a transcription of what he said. Oh, he said they're an aggressive brand of Christianity, intent on conversion, especially of Muslims. They're perceived to be particularly anti-Muslim in its outlook, and they're strongly associated with George Bush. It was back in Bush's presidency. And he went on to say that in connection with Bush, that in his view, Bush claiming to be born again, that the invasion of Muslim Iraq and Afghanistan was in some way associated with religious belief. So a very clear sort of antagonism towards evangelicals. And yet other Muslims are a lot more, at least engaged, if not appreciative. And Joseph Cumming who has been involved in a lot of Christian Muslim conferences, engagement and so on. He reports meeting one Muslim at a conference who said, "We want to work with you evangelicals because we feel like we have something in common with you. We want to be talking with Christians who take their scriptures seriously." And so whilst for some Muslims there might be a degree of antipathy or a feeling that evangelicals are against them, for others I think there's a sense of we can identify, we have some things in common here. And maybe that will be something that could well be looked into a little bit further, Muslim views and responses to evangelicals. Okay, so just to flag very briefly some different types of responses, and most people writing on this topic give quite a simplistic sort of typology of evangelicals or even Christians more generally. Bennett's is a more general description, and he says on one hand there are those who are confrontational towards Muslims, and the other hand there are those who are more conciliatory. Martin Akkad, who's a friend and colleague of ours in Beirut, uses these labels. He says there are some who are Islam antagonistic and there are some who are Islam friendly. And of course, there are then all stops in between as well. And these two poles in some ways mirror the Runnymede Trust's description when they were describing Islamophobia. When they produced their report back in the 90s, they talked about those who had closed views of Islam on one hand and open views of Islam on the other hand. And those who had closed views of Islam were those who saw it as being monolithic. They saw Islam holding itself separate. They saw it as being inferior. It was something to be feared. It was an enemy. And yet, on the other hand, for those who are rather more open, they would see Islam as being diverse, yes, different, but also being a partner and being sincere in their engagement. If you want the PowerPoint afterwards, I'm very happy to make it available, and you can have a little look at those categories a bit further yourself. But I think we probably all recognize that spectrum of those who have very fixed ideas of a monolithic Islam through to those who are much more open to the diversity that's within Islam. And certainly these types and this spectrum is seen time and again as we go through some of these studies. And I want to start out with some textual studies that have been done in the last 20 years. I already mentioned Kate Zabiri. She came at the end of the 90s with a very well-received book that looked at, as I said, Protestant missionary views of Islam, and mentioned quite a few of the people who would still be writing on the topic today, like Colin Chapman, Phil Parshall, Dudley Woodbury, and so on. And then she also talked about those who were writing from a more academic response, and included people like Cragg and so on, and others again that we'd be familiar with. But the interesting thing about her study was that she also looked at the mirror image, and she looked at popular Muslim responses to Christianity and also at Muslim academic responses. So it's still a very helpful and interesting work. And if you are interested in thinking about Muslim responses and views of Christianity, then Hugh Goddard's work on Muslim perceptions of Christianity is still a very helpful starting place. But moving into the new millennium, following 9/11, there were a couple of early studies that were done in the US context. And so Hoover and Simoneau were both article length pieces of work that were beginning to look at both comparing before and after, but also what was driving the new writing from evangelicals about Islam. And so Dennis Hoover, who was a political scientist, he was looking at some of the US evangelical, both evangelical publications, Christianity Today and World magazine, and he looked at them following the 2 years after 9/11. He was doing a content analysis, looking at the types of articles that were being written, whether they were referring to violence and terrorism or so on, whether they were looking at persecution of Christians in Muslim lands and so on. And he was asking the question is, do they reflect, and of course, Huntington's Clash of Civilization had just come out in 96, do they reflect this clash of civilizations? And he found a mixed bag. He suggested that not all evangelicals were reacting in the same way. And this is going to be a very common trope as we go through. So he suggested that in actual fact, some evangelicals like Jerry Falwell and others who were very strong in their response were actually very influential in their own sub-tradition, but were less influential across the whole range of evangelicals. Simoneau too found something somewhat similar. He didn't just look at Christian magazine publications, he also looked at a range of books. And the interesting thing was that he looked before and after 9/11. So he took 10 years before and the 3 years after 9/11. And he did find that there was increased antagonism in the writing during that time. He also found that there was an increase in concern or opposition to the idea of interfaith engagement, and particularly interfaith worship. And he identified 4 different types of books, 4 different types of writing during those periods. He looked at apologetic writing, particularly identified some of the work by converts from a Muslim background, like the Cana brothers, Mark Gabriel, and so on, as well as some well-known Christian apologists, Robert Morey. John Ankerberg is a TV personality in the States, and found that these works were particularly antagonistic, even polemic. Then he found that there was literature that was talking, putting Islam into a prophetic context, what's going to happen in the future, the eschatology of it all, and Hal Lindsey, author of The Late Great Planet Earth, George Otis, The Last of the Giants, seeing Islam as being some sort of spiritual, demonic player in the end times. And this was a theme that was also picked up in some charismatic writing about Islam. And he mentions Peter Wagner, Reza Safar, another convert from Islam. But he also recognized that there were evangelicals who were writing from a softer, more engaged position that he called contextualists. I don't think it was particularly sort of nuanced piece of writing. He tends to lump quite a few different people in the same category, but picked up on people like Maluhi, who was writing much more empathetically about Islam. But the major piece of work that was done in the decade following 9/11 was by Thomas Kidd. He wrote a full-length book and then also a chapter that looked at this apocalyptic type perspective of Islam that appeared in an edited volume. But his book on American Christians and Islam traces the history in the American context right back from the early 19th century, the Barbary Wars, the Corsair pirates who captured American Christians, held them captive, the early missions to Muslims, particularly looks at Zuayma, and then through the Arab-Israeli wars in the post-war period. And he too finds certain types of writing and certain things that particularly interest a Christian audience. He summed these up as missions to Muslims. So stories of people who have actually gone as missionaries into Muslim context. Islam in the last days. So again, this eschatological idea. And then also an interest in biographies of those Muslims who have converted to Christianity. And he found that, yes, following 9/11, there was this great flood of new literature, emphasizing things like terrorism and the prophetic and the end times and so on. He looks at some of the statements of some of the more egregious evangelical statements that were made from Pat Robertson, Franklin Graham, and so on. Probably familiar with some of the very strong things they said about Islam. Again, looks at the work of converts from Islam, and particularly talks about them dishing the dirt on Islam, and of writing exposés of Islam. But then again finds those who are more Irenic in their approach, and again mentions Woodbury and Partial, and so on. I'll skip over that. Another full-length book that I'll just mention in passing. Again, it's a textual study. Walter Ratliff, he also looked at both books and magazine articles, and he too found that there was what he called a new fault line in the evangelical religious landscape that runs across denominational boundaries in the US. And he found that evangelicals are walking a line between militant opposition and constructive engagement with Islam. So again, found that spectrum between the two poles. You'll find a review of this book that I wrote a few years ago on our website. Just to mention the British context, there's not been a full book-length treatment of the British context, either a textual or an empirical study. But Andrew Atherston wrote a chapter. Andrew is here in Wycliffe in Oxford. And I also have a chapter in a collected volume that was written for a Christian audience, tensions in, it was in the book, Between Naivety and Hostility. But just to mention that Andrew's article, as with the other articles, found that there were different genre or different approaches in writing, and he found 5 types of writing as he did a historical, again looking right through the Protestant missionary period, slightly less emphasis on the contemporary period. But he found 5 types of writing, again, stories about exemplary missionaries, starting with Henry Martin through Zwemer and to some more modern examples. He found different approaches to apologetics, and again, the more harder polemical approach, along with some more reasons apologetic work as well. But then also an unveiling of Islam. So books that have things in the title like expose or unveiling or Islam revealed, those sorts of books that are basically a warning of Islamization and a warning of what is to come. Then he also found books that were interested in prophetic prediction and looking into the future, as well as, again, an interest in stories of those who had converted to Christianity out of Islam.
Sorry.
Hey, welcome.
Sorry,
come on.
I'm late. I couldn't find parking.
No worries. Come and join us.
Thank you.
So those were all textual studies. They were looking either at published books or magazine articles or so on. And there have just been a very few empirical studies that have actually ventured out into the field and done some interview, qualitative and even quantitative field work. And just want to mention 3 in particular. So Amit Bhatia is an American-based academic. I'll show you some of his work in a moment. Ashley Kwosek, I'm delighted that Ashley's with us this afternoon. It's lovely to see you, Ashley. You're very welcome. And I'll try to be kind and hope I don't say anything mistaken about your work. So we'll touch on Ashley's work. And then here in the UK, Greg Smith has done some work as well on some survey data. So just think, Amit Bhatia, who wrote the book Engaging Muslims in Islam, he did some field work in the US. So his book actually does do some textual analysis, engages quite deeply with evangelical theology of religion, also engages with sociology of religion, so some theoretical grounding, but then goes on and he works in 4 churches in Chicago and interviews 40 church members, grassroots evangelicals, and then several of their leaders, as well as a case study with a Christian agency working in Chicago. And he asked these people a whole range of questions. You don't have to read them all now. You might want to get the PowerPoint later, but here was just a selection out of the 10 questions that he asked. He asked them their reaction. What comes to mind when you hear about Islam? Do you know Muslims personally? Can Muslims be good citizens in the US? Do they worship the same God? And so on. And then he analyzes all the responses that he gets, obviously finds a diversity of response. And one of the interesting things that he finds, and again, we probably would intuitively guess this, but he finds that overwhelmingly, these people that he's interviewing, they're actually, everything they're reading has a negative orientation. So whether it's from the media or whether it's from writings by Christian leaders, they're actually having negative perceptions being reinforced. And interestingly, he says most of the respondents had not read writings by Muslim authors. So the only religious voice they have access to are the voice of American Christian leaders and, of course, the media as well. And as I say, we might intuitively know that, or suspect that, but it's interesting to have that confirmed by some qualitative field work. And so he recognizes that there's a tension within the people that he's interviewing, where he says that they are fearful and mistrusting and suspicious of Muslims, but at the same time, they do recognize that it would be beneficial for both them and for Muslims if there was more interaction. So there's something of a conflict in the way that these evangelicals are thinking about the Muslims around them. And he actually identifies 2 groups of evangelicals. He said that there was one group who, when they engage with Muslims, are very much keeping in mind Christian truth claims and doctrine, if you like. That's their principal guide in their interaction with Muslims. But then he found another group, and he said that this group, in actual fact, that their guiding principle was more likely to be things like freedom of religion, and sort of welcoming into society, and that would actually take some sort of stronger place maybe than the truth claims that might normally be associated with evangelicals. In other words, there's some sort of conflictedness within evangelical responses, those he was talking about, which is actually the subtitle of Ashley Crosirk's book, American Evangelicals Conflicted on Islam. And so Ashley also recognizes this conflict. She, along with some textual analysis, also did some field work, went to talk to people in 2 different churches in the southern states of the US, interviewed 29 leaders from those churches and from other places, but then 50 congregants from those 2 churches, and again asked them similar questions and asked the same question across each group and across each church. And those questions included things about whether they were aware of the conflict in evangelical thought about Islam, their responses and reactions and attitudes to the Quran, Muhammad, to interfaith dialogue, and 2 particularly interesting questions, one about Chrislam. And Chrislam is this idea that if you have Christianity and Islam, if you become too friendly with each other, and if you begin to sort of blend or mix the theology at all, then you end up with this new hybrid syncretistic religion called Chrislam. So she was asking them, are you aware of the discussion around the dangers of Chrislam, which has actually particularly come from a missions context? And I think I'm right in saying that, in actual fact, from the congregants, only about 50% of them said that they even recognize that as a category, where as many more of the leaders were aware of that sort of debate. And then she also asked about a common word, which was an initiative back in 2007, a letter from a whole group of Muslim leaders to the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury and so on, and which resulted in a series of dialogue type conferences and meetings together. And so asking whether these interviewees were aware and whether they approved, thought it was a good thing or not. And obviously opinion was again divided. And Ashley plots these responses against a typology that she developed, which again reflects our basic typology of right to left, confrontational to conciliatory, but she labels as traditional and progressive, but then also has some middle ground positions that are hybrid, progressive traditional and traditional progressive. And again finds that there's significant diversity, disagreement amongst evangelicals, but one of the interesting things for me was that she particularly found that evangelical leaders are more extreme in their views, they're more polarized than their congregations are. So in actual fact, the congregants themselves tended to have some of these more hybrid middle ground labels rather than being found at the extreme poles, which is a very interesting finding. And one of the things that Ashley finds out at the end of her work and suggests that would be of benefit, and this harks back to, we were thinking about what Muslims think of evangelicals, she suggests that if Muslims themselves could actually see the diversity of evangelicals, then that would maybe help in their understanding. Not all evangelicals conform to the stereotypical image of angry, hateful Islamophobes. There are those who are more engaged with Muslims. You might be interested in another piece of work that Ashley did with one of her colleagues, George Yancey, also interviewing a lot of Muslims, but with wider application. And you can find it in a book called One Faith No Longer. And in that book, they also find that American evangelicals, again, this is all in the US context, are very divided, not just on Islam, but all sorts of issues. And they actually posit the question of whether these two groups can even stay together to be part of one religion. And they suggest that just in the same way that US is very politically polarized today, that it's difficult to make any argument that progressive and conservative Christians, and you might use the label evangelical, belong in the same religious group. We don't have time to explore that before, but a very interesting question. So one final piece of empirical work, just before we look briefly at the African context. Greg Smith here in the UK is a social scientist who's done a lot of work on big surveys. He's worked quite a bit for the Evangelical Alliance in the UK. And he actually did a survey of Evangelical Alliance members, looking at over 1,300 responses to survey questions. This was actually about other religions more broadly. And there were questions about theology of religion, for instance, exclusivity, who will be saved. Looked at evangelicals' knowledge of other religions, not just Islam, but how much they know about Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. Asked questions about mission to other religions. Do other religions need to be saved? Is it right to send missionaries to other countries? Those sorts of questions. Education, faith education. What should be taught in schools? Who should access it, and so on. But then at the end of the survey, they also asked some optional questions that were specifically about Islam. So this was actually very interesting for anybody interested in our topic. And he asked questions about their response to halal food, to the wearing of the niqab, hijab in the workplace and so on, Sharia law in Britain, whether Islam is inherently violent, and so on. That data, the reference is in my PowerPoint. If you want to go away and look at that data, it's quantitative data that he puts number and percentage against. But again, he finds that evangelicals are diverse and divided, and says in the UK also, evangelicals do not entirely conform to the stereotype of a conservative evangelicalism that's nationalistic, religiously right, and he suggests that's the typical view of evangelicals in the US. So just to mention, before we think about, for the last few moments, about some further research that might be done, there has been work done in other parts of the world. I've particularly talked about the US. That is where the majority of work on evangelicals has been done, particularly by sociologists. A little less work has been done in this country, but even less work has been done on evangelicals, and might include Pentecostals, in that around the world. The one place that's beginning to do more work is Africa, and particularly West Africa. And our colleague John Azuma, it's our sister centre in Accra, the Lamine Sane Institute, and he's done some work with an edited volume, and he's gathering African scholars together to do this sort of work. A lot of it's been historical and thematic. There's not been so much empirical work being done yet. But just to mention a couple of authors or researchers who are working in particularly Nigeria. Matthews Ojo has particularly been looking at Pentecostals and peacemaking movements in Nigeria. So has produced some articles and chapters. And then the book that I discovered yesterday was by Akinade, and he's been working in Nigeria. He's a Christian himself, but particularly looks at Pentecostal responses to Islam in Nigeria, and finds some of the same trends. I think puts it that they are rather more rooted in earlier 20th century responses. It tends to be rather more antagonistic. There's more demonization of Islam, but then there are also Christians who are involved in peacemaking initiatives and so on. But mainly for Pentecostals, he feels that the response is actually a missionary response, and particularly the opportunity to send missionaries to northern Nigeria, where the majority of Muslims are. I should just mention that Christopher Wadibia, who I think is here in Oxford, did his PhD in Cambridge, has also been writing on Nigeria and Pentecostalism in Nigeria and development work, but also touches a bit on Islam in that context as well. So there's some interesting things developing now in Africa. And so just to throw out in the last couple of minutes, some things where I think we could very usefully see some more research being done. It's one thing to identify this spectrum of responses, of those who are confrontational, those who are conciliatory, and so on, those who are using more polemical or apologetic approaches, and those who are more engaged in dialogue, research, understanding, reconciliation, and so on. But it would be really good to actually know what the fruits or the outcomes or the impacts of those different approaches is, to actually have more empirical data on what those outcomes are. There tend to be very strong feelings about the right way to approach. There are claims by those who are polemicists that people are leaving Islam because of their arguments. And then there would be claims from those who are involved in more Irenic reconciliation work that bridges are being built. But where does all this lead? And it would be interesting to have more work done on that, which would then also maybe mean that we need a little bit more work on actually how are Muslims perceiving evangelical responses to Islam. And so as I intimated earlier, it would be good to get some more data. It would be good to see some field work being done talking to Muslims about those things. I particularly mention the context of the global south, and I think that's certainly a whole area that's under investigated at the moment, and that's actually where the church is growing the most. Some of the explosion amongst Pentecostal churches in Africa and so on. And so for the future of interaction between Christians and Muslims, particularly in that continent, really important to know what the trends are in Pentecostals responding to Islam. And then finally, I'll end here, just some more research and looking into the connection between evangelicals and war, violence, and particularly right-wing politics as well, and the fruits that that bears. In the African context, there is talk of what's called third cheek theology, where African Christians say, we've been attacked and we turned our cheek, as Jesus commanded, and we got struck again. Now we have no cheeks left to turn. And so some are developing a theology of retaliation, or at least of self-defense. Where is that leading? What are the outcomes of that? Certainly, I've talked to people in the West African context who have seen even evangelical Christians responding violently to their Muslim neighbors. But then in the Western context, and not just in America, but in Western Europe as well, what does it mean when evangelical Christians support war and foreign intervention on Muslim soil? Where does that lead? And so some big questions around that. And then in particular, the alliances that evangelicals form with right-wing political figures. We see that particularly in North America, but even here in the UK, just in the last few days, if you're in the UK context, there was an article in The Guardian where it came to light there's a group of very well-known Christians in the House of Lords had a secret gathering for the last 10 years and had some meetings together with right-wing political figures. And of course, when this came out into the open, there was a report, The Guardian picked it up, questions being asked about whether this is right, whether there can be these links between people who have political positions in the House of Lords, religious figures, and then other right-wing activists. And that's a whole big question that's just coming to light here in the UK, and I think bears further research as well. But I'll leave it there. If you want the PowerPoint, then all the references are there as well. But I think we'll leave it there and turn it over to Martin to field some questions. Thank you.